Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our second session, our second lecture in the WGS Women and Gender Studies series, Spotlight series. I am thrilled to be here with you today. It is energizing. It is energizing to gather in a space where ideas, justice, and community don't just meet, but they move us. Um, the WGS Spotlight series is a monthly forum um, that aims to lift up the work of scholars, activists, artists, and community leaders who are shaping the discourse on gender, who are shaping the discourse on sexuality, race, power, and justice. Again, as I always say, think of this series as a celebration as well as an call in, an open door to learn, to reflect, and to engage. For those who I haven't met yet, my name is Nermeen Alam, and I direct the Women's and Gender Studies program at Rutgers, Newark. Um, today's lecture is titled "Let the Water Teach You: Radical Wellness as Liberation from Worthiness and Work." I'm super excited about today's lecture. The lecture centers radical practices, uh, not as luxury, but as liberation. We know that self-care, uh, self-care for femmes and women of color is um, is resistance. It resists the script. It resists the script that says serve first. It resists the script that says rest last and earn your worth. Instead, Professor Porterfield asks, what does it mean? What does it mean to reclaim rest, to reclaim routine and reflection as a political act? Um, Professor Porterfield talks about, especially for those who are in high stress field, those who hold heavy worlds. For them, self-care becomes praxis, a daily refusal um, to be reduced to your labor alone. We are honored to welcome Professor Laura Porterfield. Professor Porterfield is an assistant professor she's an assistant professor of urban education at Rutgers, Newark. Her Seeing Wellness project, which today's lecture builds upon and speaks to. Her project eliminates how they use critical reflection, self-consciousness, and radical imagination to counter the emotional labor of everyday justice work. Professor Porterfield's research also examines equity and justice in education, exploring how visuality and effect, how they shape disciplinary practices in schools, especially and including disproportionate punitive responses to Black and other youth of color. This is really scholarship that bridges. This is really scholarship that bridges classroom and city, that bridges feelings and structure, and that bridges wellness and liberation. Again, please join me in welcoming Professor Porterfield. She will share with us her insight for the next 30 minutes or so. And then we will have some time for questions and comments. We will turn it now to Professor Porterfield. Again, a pleasure to welcome you in our series.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here today. Thank you again, Dr. Nermeen Alam, and the WGS department for inviting me to share and connect with you all. As Dr. Alam has already sort of mentioned, I'll be talking about an ongoing project of mine called the Seeing Wellness Research Project, which is a participatory visual ethnography that really is centered on exploring the transformative self-care, wellness, and healing practices of self-identified women, trans, and gender non-conforming BIPOC folks who are really at the front lines doing diversity and justice work in their leadership positions, both in the global North and South. Um, this project is really generated from the notion that the diversity double duty, as Corinne Castro, a feminist sociologist, calls it, the sort of emotional labor, the racialized trauma, the heteropatriarchy at play in the various institutional and community spaces where diversity and justice work occurs, really puts femme and non-binary folks under constant threat, right? And this threat is compounded by what Cheri Moraga calls the profound costs of just being us, right? That is the resulting burnout, fatigue, racialized exhaustion that we carry while also relegated to the margins of our communities. Moraga says, sort of simply, stress is too benign a term. But there's been a long history of critical discourse around caring and wellness among women and femme folks, from Audre Lorde's like Queer Black Manifesto, A Burst of Light, to Moraga's and Ansaldua's Post-Colonial Feminist volume, This Bridge Called My Back and This Bridge Called Home. And this discourse really centers around the necessity of critical reflection and development of critical self-consciousness, and then a larger sort of cross-group development and commitment to praxis for educators, practitioners, activists, and community organizers. Because as what has and will continue to be radical about this discourse and about the practice of healing and wellness itself, as we all know, which is best sort of captured by Lorde, caring is not self-indulgence, it's preservation, and that is an act of political warfare, excuse me. And furthermore, as Brooks Tatum notes, self-care for femme and women of color is subversive in so much that it undermines a long-standing social norm that reinforces that they should always put their families and their communities and society's needs before their own. And the Seeing Wellness Project really highlights the subversive ways that the participants engaged in this project, who I'll talk about in a moment, participate and engage in these practices of reflection and self-consciousness, and also the radical imagination to counter the emotional labor of their everyday work. And, you know, though we've sort of seen more and more sharing of wellness practices across communities on social media, I'm interested in sort of comprehensive long form explorations of the topic. In particular, I'm really interested in connecting with and extending existing scholarly and artistic work on the topic by documenting the process of self-caring, how it's embodied, how and when and where it takes place, how it changes over time. The guiding question I've asked in the Seeing Wellness project is, what does transformational self-care look like for trans women and gender nonconforming BIPOC folks within the context of their diversity and justice leadership? So as a grounding exercise I always do in my classes, sort of sharing intellectual tools, I want to explain what I mean by some of these terms that I'll talk about and integrate as we discuss this even further. So what do we mean when we say diversity and justice leadership? Here I pull from Tribe's definition of social justice as the right to self-determination, as a fair allocation of resources, and to live in peace, freedom from constraints, and to be treated fairly and equitably. I also draw from the literature on social justice and diversity leadership, notably the work of Kip Graham, who articulates that social justice and diversity leaders adopt principles that place matters of inequity at the center of their advocacy, that they take conscious and deliberate actions to create environments that confront and also dismantle systematic inequalities by addressing said inequities in policy and culture and in practice. As Jasmine Williams notes, social justice leadership is thus both philosophical and practical. So drawing on these ideas, I define diversity and justice leadership as substantive, personal, community, or professional work advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and or justice for BIPOC. This leadership does not need to be in a formal or professional capacity. It's also important to sort of situate what we mean when we talk about visualizing or seeing. And I think about visualizing and seeing as unearthing the everyday, unseen, or unnoticed phenomenon that are often hidden in plain sight. I think about visualizing and seeing as visualizing with the eyes, but also as in the sight, the knowing, right? It's engaged intuition. Um, and invisibility, according to Tere Moraga, is an unnatural disaster. And visibility is the most effective strategy to quell the rising tide of discrimination. I love this quote by Chetty Moraga in this bridge called My Back, because it really connects the idea of seeing and visuality to the sort of everyday taken for granted ways that we sacrifice ourselves in the cause of uh, reversing and resisting oppression. That lands with great force, as Cole Arthur Riley says, upon the body, right? She talks about racism and colonialism as a violence that lands upon the body. So connected to this is this idea of achieving wellness, right? And embodied wellness. What does that mean? um, I like to think of embodied wellness as the process of fully honoring, tapping into, and listening to our intuition, right? The sight, the seeing, but also the sight as felt in the body, and listening to that, and engaging in practices that are aimed at healing and reversing said violence and trauma, right? So healing then is the resilience instinct of our bodies. Adrienne Marie Brown sort of talks about healing as this instinct, which happens when we give full attention to a place of trauma or pain, right? And then when we do pay attention, when we do give attention, we are engaging in an act of radical self-care. So I call upon many people, but particularly Angela Davis, who did a talk in 2020, really uh, sort of laying bare the idea that self-care is not individualistic, to reject a sort of individual level Western notion of self-care as one that is focused on the self in relation to community and community healing. And last but not least, we are doing all of this in the context of justice and liberation work, but ultimately with the goal of liberation, which I have really conceptualized as a hard-won exorcism from societal norms and standards of behavior or thought. It's a prerequisite to freedom. I like to think of liberation, perhaps the goal of all of our diversity and justice work. And as Tony Cade Bambra has taught us, we must make just and liberated futures irresistible, right? So how do we do this? I've done this in a number of ways in my approach to studying our wellness and self-care practices, particularly through using arts-based methodology. As I mentioned, Seeing Wellness Project is a visual ethnography where participants and myself, so I'm a part of the study as well, use photo voice and filmmaking to document and reflect on our care practices. A photo voice is a participatory photographic image production method where participants are given cameras and asked to use their own devices to visually capture and narratively represent their thoughts on a particular question or issue. This process of image production is generally followed by a structured interview or focus group session where participants sort of discuss and critically engage in photographic meaning making to produce and share knowledge with the wider community. So to date, the Seeing Wellness Project has included 14 recorded photo elicitation interviews with 11 participants, and I've collected a total with my participants as co-conspirators and collaborators, a total of over 100, participant generated photos. And I'm still in the process of soliciting additional participants for this study. But this is, as I mentioned before, a long form exploration of the topic because caring practices are never done. The current participants are university professors or community researchers, primary and secondary school teachers, criminal justice reform advocates, mental health practitioners in the US, Canada, Uruguay, Senegal, South Africa, France, and Australia. I began the first interviews by asking participants to share a bit about the nature of their diversity, equity, and justice work. Many of them speak on the dualities of releasing and holding that being on the front lines of diversity and justice work demands. For Marisol, whose diversity and justice work is situated in the academy, but beyond those borders as well, whose roots extend to coming up in LA with immigrant parents as a first generation Chicana in the US, having received a solid, even radical, by her definition, education in Los Angeles public schools. The need for wellness has come up in her research explicitly and in her own embodied practices of listening, right? For Marisol, yoga and the release that the practice enables is not a luxury, but a necessity. This release is an anti-capitalist wellness posture, a refusal, right? She says in the interview, I'm not holding this shit. She knows that for women of color, often our worth is about self-sacrifice. To that, she responds, proclaiming, no, I want to live. As a deep feminist praxis, I refuse. I want to live. Similarly, and though not, in the same continental context, Relebokile Moletsane is a Black South African woman located in Durban. Her DEIJ work began with curriculum theory and HIV prevention, and now centers on preventing and eradicating gender-based violence. She works in the city, but her gender-based violence work is often in rural areas outside of Durban. So this commute, the literal driving back and forth in the context of doing her work really came up as she was mentoring other students. But she realized she also needed to care for herself because she was just going without stopping and without thinking. She says, I've always thought that I'm strong and that I'm able to leave things at work and come home. But then my students, most of whom do the kind of work that I do, I suppose that's why they came to me. And I realize very much that I need to steer them into self-care. She goes on to say, And then I began to realize that I also needed self-care because I was just going and going and going without stopping, without thinking about what I was hearing and seeing and how that was affecting my well-being. And thanks to my students, I began to also look at my own well-being that way. She does lay counseling, she calls it, with her students. And she has sort of developed some care rituals that developed during COVID, in particular, that include not working over the weekends, stop working at 5 p.m. And she goes on to say, for me, it's like double because I'm the senior member of the team. I have to debrief with the participants in the field, debrief with my team, and then who debriefs me? She says, I have to debrief myself. I have to be the bigger person. I'm the older person and the senior person in the team. So she's constantly taking on double care roles without the ability to be cared for.
Are there instances or patterns?
Jackie Robinson Hunsaker is a Jamaican American woman whose DEIJ work is centered around cultural memory through indigenous food pathways in the Caribbean and West Africa. Her DEIJ work extends beyond her research, and it starts in the home. So I'm going to play a quick interview clip with Jackie here.
Patterns of things that come up for you in the context of the work that you do around diversity and justice that really bring home the need for wellness, or for you to engage with your wellness practices?
Oh yeah, I mean, when I have, if I have an encounter, right, um, where I am, if I have a negative encounter, that's race related, right, and I definitely need to come back to my center, right, and there have been, unfortunately, many times, right, where I've had to deal with, someone who is racially, who's a racist, or just a racist, right? Yes, and I've had to like actually engage, and even within that period of engaging with this racist administrator, right, that I had to actually access intentionally so my my wellness, right, so that I did not do something that, or act out of character, right. And so anyway, and so yes, and so I can access it, and I have in mid sentence. Here, there's an encounter happening. Racist woman talking, disrespecting me. I'm not going to go into details, right? And I had to literally turn around from this woman, right? Take 3 long cleansing ujjayi breaths, honest to God, right? Then turn around and re-engage with calmness, right? But also real clarity, right? And pointedness about this Ross business shit I do, right? And so anyway, it's
Jackie's recounting demonstrates the everyday ways that Black women, and particularly Black mothers, are emotionally and spiritually assaulted, right? These assaults, when held and not released, accumulate. Jackie walks us through her processing and her response, right? Through the breath, through remembering her mothers and aunties, and ultimately herself. And that begs the question, what are others doing in moments like these? If wellness is about wholeness, if it's an invitation to come back to yourself, as Jackie mentions, what are others doing to come back to themselves? So to this, I offer other participants' responses to the first prompt for the project, which was, what do you do on a regular or semi-regular basis to be well? The themes that emerge from the participants' responses in this sort of cornucopia of images you see here really speak to nature, water, trees, light, pace, movement, walking, yoga, dancing, meditation, and family and community and memory. These thematic responses also speak to the aforementioned politics of refusal, of dignity, of dignifying, of creating, of holding and releasing, of stillness and quiet as reclamation, and of rest, right? But let us begin today by looking at the most repeated element in folks' responses, water, right? In all but two participants' photographic responses to prompt 1, and with absolutely no interference from me, water appeared as the most commonly and explicitly repeated element, right? I'm gonna fast forward here. And CC, who is an Argentinian Canadian visual sociologist, she talks about body and bodies as indicative of an effort to take care of herself, right? CC is also a caretaker for her ailing sister and mother. And she talks about the need to have a bit of fun and engage in all modes of the body, which is something I have become more and more alienated from in the context of the capitalist culture she lives and abides in. Lebo, in her responses to the first prompt, also talks about the ocean. She says, the ocean continues to fascinate me, and I particularly love listening to the waves crashing on the beach. The soothing sounds of the sea takes me to a much healthier space spiritually and emotionally. She also offers that this reveals the type of labor she does to even get up to do the work, right? She says, quote, I have to work hard to either work around the chaos of the city or avoid it. So in the work I work around it. I seek spaces where it's not chaotic. When I asked her, what can we do with this image in the context of diversity and justice work? She said, let's imagine what resources we have that make us feel happy or that make us feel calm. For me, I have the sea. Lynette Mulwitty also integrated a photo with a water bottle, which really talks about the need for taking care of herself. And she mentioned that since COVID, she sort of adopted a solidarity time to one night a hotel in a month. She says, this helps to give me space to think, to write, to read, and most importantly, to catch up on sleep. As someone raised as an only child, an ambivert, Lynette says, I really need my me time in order to rejuvenate and play nicely with others. And specifically about water, she says, I'd also say that the water is there too, right? I have a big jug of water, which I also have. I think that also highlights about why we do work. It's making sure that we keep ourselves healthy, especially now. Sometimes that water bottle I have as a visual reminder. She also mentions that this water bottle is a reminder to the costs of not taking care, right? She says, I was very dehydrated. I also couldn't get the chance to get water that day, which also didn't help everything. She taught me from that moment, again, as a teacher, work is not everything, and this place will kill you. This place doesn't love you. This is in response to Lynette's photos to what are you doing on a regular, semi-regular basis to be well. And her response is listening to her teachers, one of whom was a child that she had at 15 weeks in the context of her diversity and justice work, who unfortunately passed away, right? And so this need for self-caring and cost and the real lived experiences of people who have experienced that loss in the context of this work because they, you know, a myriad of factors, but the pull and pressure to not take care of ourselves is real and has real material and personal consequences. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because, you know, time is slipping away very quickly. Let's see. You could see Gabby David, as I mentioned, is a Uruguayan visual sociologist and scholar, educator. She took these pictures during COVID in Uruguay. She talks about connecting with nature and the sea, the ocean, man. I mean, the ocean beats everything. She talks about the sea as being connected to who she is as a person, who her family are. So about family and identity. Y'all forgive me, I'm zipping through these because, like I said, I want to get to some of the discussion. I'm going to leave time for discussion. Uh, she ends with a thought that I think is really important here, where she says, "What can I do to feel less anxious?" In the context of what folks can do um, with an image like this. She said, "I would recommend that you face what you know is giving you this kind of anxiety or increased level, and face that, not pushing it down until it explodes. Because if not, then it might be too late for you." Right? Again, pointing to some of the costs of putting caring praxis last or completely um, out of our consideration. I'll end with Sherry Gilmore's offerings in response to our first prompt here. She's a Afro-Latinx woman and a coach and an entrepreneur. Her DEIJ work is centered around holding space for others, mostly marginalized folks seeking leadership, coaching, and support. Here she talks about, in our first interview, she shared the following reflection on the types of questions she poses to others, additionally revealing how coaching is driven by her attunement to flow, water, and energy. She says, "How do I use my life energy for causes that are important to me? I think I find that a lot of people, I want to use the word drown. It feels very dramatic, but maybe it's the point. Like a lot of people drown in focusing on the wrong things, but things that other people tell them they should care about. Other people tell them that are important. Things that the society stresses you should do, you should be, you should achieve, all these shoulds. Water is present in Sherry's reflection in its mentally destructive and symbolically metaphysical form, drowning. This Sherry offers is symptomatic of folks not living in divine flow and ignoring their own intuition. Unholding and releasing, Sherry says, a lot of the work that we do is sort of how do we release that? How do we create our own narrative? How do we release society's shoulds? I'm inspired by Sherry's example of embodied curiosity, which is inherently a posture of openness and possibility. On a regular basis, Sherry practices curiosity through listening or presence or presentness, through tapping and connecting to ancestral rituals and signals, especially connected to light and water. This image she titled Water is Life, she captioned by saying, "Taking baths have been my saving grace during the pandemic. The water feels like home. It's become a ritual I practice at least 3 times a week." Her connection to water further reveals the power of ritual in her grounding and healing practice. Water is life. I'll start the day with a little gift to me that's sitting in that water. And so that water, these baths have literally given me life. They've kept me going. And it's more than just the water, it's a whole getting back to ritual. So I'm going to fast forward a little bit. I like to sort of share some of my ruminations about why water came up so often. I began to ask myself as I was sifting through all of the data that I received from folks during this process. And water, as I said, sort of came up over and over again. What does water have to teach us about wellness, about justice, about liberation? It probably goes without saying that water has been used and cited throughout the ages and in many different forms as both tremendously healing and devastatingly destructive, right? We've seen recent examples of that. The many forms of water, from its liquefied form to blood to clouds to raindrops to glaciers as big as mountains, exist to be and to move. As Ariagada, Harris, and Splikalova posit, indigenous ontologies and epistemologies have long emphasized notions of interconnection and mutuality, situating water and aquatic species as kin, or centering on notions of respect, reciprocity, or love. They go on to argue that those of us involved in feminist praxis and study ought to, quote, rethink our connection to water in ways that foster strengthened sense of connection, mutuality, and care, particularly in the wake of the ongoing violence of settler colonialism. Citing the work of feminist humanist philosopher Astrida Nemanis, who suggests we reframe our understanding of our bodies and ourselves as part of a reformulated watery subjectivity, which is a feminist and embodied politics of location that takes seriously the situatedness of our bodies and the mutuality of water worlds within our lives and well-being. Nemanis asks what it would mean to fundamentally understand that we are all bodies of water, given that we are all primarily made up of water, our bodies are porous, and water passes through us and back to the environment. I was recently reminded of my own ancestral connection to water, which I've long since felt a personal connection to it. I labored and gave birth to my son in the water. I honor my sister's life and spirit by spreading her ashes in each new body of water that I encounter. My parents were married at the bluff in Natchez overlooking the Mississippi River. And so much of life before me has happened in or around water, right? Like the way stationing of the Asimosa River in Ghana, where my ancestors bathed before being shipped across the Atlantic, or that mighty ocean graveyard, right, that carried so many of them to the elsewhere. Water is both symbolic and symbiotic. What does it mean that water is the site of both life and death? I believe that Adia Gada Harris, Blitchelkova, and Nimanis' work shows up for those of us doing deep, hard, toiling diversity and justice care work as a reminder to claim our birthright to simply be. Like the water, and since we are water, the fact that we exist on this earth is enough. Everything else is choice. So many of us have been convinced ourselves, or convince others that we do not exist simply to exist, that we must search and search and search to find our higher purpose, our why, outside of ourselves. Water, it seems, has something else to say about that. Water's impacts on this world can be felt everywhere, all the time. Yet for all of its omnipresence and omniscience, water doesn't make grand claims about its higher purpose or its use value to others. It moves, it crashes, thrashes, restores, falls, rests, flows, it acts, it sustains, it remembers. It is. What does it mean to be water, then? What is it about water that arrests us? Is it that we are in awe of it, bearing witness to its majesty and glory and power and softness and tranquility? Yes. And perhaps that stillness we feel in its presence is an invitation, permission to be without purpose, to just exist, to connect. Perhaps radical wellness, then, is liberation from the burden of worthiness and work. It's the state of wholeness, full of paradox and messiness, quiet redemption and rest. It's when we are free to move like water, remembering and shape-shifting, when we're a full state of being, simply exercising our birthright. So what do we learn from these stories and images about radical self-care and wellness? As Cece, Marisol, Jackie, Liz, Relebojile, Lynette, Gabby, and Sherry remind us in their own ways, wellness is not merely the domain of the rich, nor is it a luxury. Nearly all of their practices come without material cost. but rather the cost of time and attention. If wellness is about wholeness, then being well is a step toward freedom and liberation, not just for freedom and liberation's sake, but rather our collective freedom from the restrictive and binding structures that seek to diminish us, to confine us, to define us as always and only valuable as our work. Perhaps wellness is rootedness, especially for Black and other BIPOC folks who've been robbed of a sense of place through the violence of colonialism and capitalism. Perhaps connection to the divine, connection to our ancestors, connection to communities is inherently linked to our wellness because it fills an emptiness and void. As Bell Hooks says in Communion, healing rarely happens in isolation. Healing is an act of communion. I was recently reminded that one of the great violences of a white supremacist production-driven capitalist culture is the way that it leads us to forget. Our individual wellness is connected to our collective wellness in so much that we are exercised from the constraints that suggest we are born to do and not to just be. The beauty of doing diversity and justice work really lies in the seeing and knowing and activation of our polyphonous epistemologies and ontologies. As conduits, diversity and justice workers bear witness to this multitude, to this chorus. As we bear witness, we remember, and remembrance may just lead to healing. Our responsibility, then, I like to sort of offer and think about, is to remember, to heal, to sustain, and fortify ourselves so that we can multiply the voices heard and create more pathways to our collective liberation. I'll end there, and hopefully we can engage in a discussion.
Wow. Thank you so much, Professor Porterfield. That was incredibly profound and fascinating. I trust that this conversation will stay for long with me. I am gonna check the chat for questions. We have 15 minutes for questions and comments for Professor Porterfield. And please drop your questions in the chat box and we will read them out. And I have a few questions that I am going to abuse my chairing and ask them. But again, please, if any of the participants, the audience, have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box and we will read them out loud. Professor Porterfield, your presentation opened up with talking about how giving our full attention to the place of trauma and pain, right? And honestly, like listening to this, it kind of felt scary that it is scary to give your full attention to pain and trauma. It's almost like if you give them your full attention, they can end up encompassing you, right? They can end, spilling over and overflowing your life. So I think as I'm listening to the presentation and I'm reading all these wonderful quotes from people on how they face their trauma and pain, I am faced with this question of whether to face it and when do you face it, and honestly, when do you release it, right? When is self-care facing the pain and the trauma, and when is it just releasing them, recognizing that there is little that you can do, that we can't be saving someone's life every single day, right? And if we don't, that doesn't make us like a bad person. It doesn't make us an educator, right? So I would love to hear more from you and from the insights from your participants on when do we face the pain and trauma and when do we release them. And maybe they are the two faces for the same coin in a certain poetic way that I can't comprehend yet.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And I think I'll start by addressing it in reverse. I'm sorry I had to speed through the end, but Sherry talks a lot about sort of releasing society's shoulds. And I liked the imagery of releasing that in the bath, right? Like just releasing that through ritual or whatever sort of cultural or ancestral or indigenous practices that feel good and right for an individual person. But I think the release happens quite often. Well, one of the things that Sherry's conversation and work inspires me constantly to think about is how I am holding on to other people's shoulds. And what of those shoulds can I release, right? What of the ways I should, or I'm told I should show up, can I release? One very small but profound example for me, though I'm not covering my head today, is head coverings, right? I am an open person spiritually. And so sometimes for my own care practices, because I absorb people's energy, I'm an emotional sponge, I'm deeply empathic. When I cover my head, I protect myself. I at least protect one channel. And this is, a cultural practice that many West Africans do and other folks do. But I, had been sort of conditioned to think that head coverings outside of for religious reasons, particularly for Black women, were seen as unprofessional in the academy, right? Like, you don't wear a head wrap, to work. You can't show up as a professor in this particular way. And honest to God, after doing this interview with Sherry, I started thinking, why am I holding on to this when it is a very small but profound practice that I can reintegrate, that will help me, that will ground me, that will help me do my job in a way that will allow me to be more free, that would allow me to be more present with my students and my colleagues, right? And in my work. I'm releasing that. I'm releasing that idea, the sort of very westernized picture of what a professor should be or should look like or should show up as. Um, and and to the trauma and pain, it is a horrible imagery, but sometimes when we're sick or when we have something in our body as a virus, one way we expel that virus is by throwing it up, right? And I hate throwing up. I hate vomiting. It feels violent, right? It feels hard and forceful. But after that, I've gotten rid of whatever was making me sick. Otherwise, it's just sitting in my gut doing damage to my body, right? And so the trauma and pain that we experience while we continue to eat it, to push it down, to let it fester, it still exists in us, right? It's still in us, causing damage, eating away at our self esteem, eating away at our energy, causing more fatigue, right? Really, in some cases, just stressing us out, right? Maybe silently, or not so silently. And the regurgitation itself, though painful, is necessary. So the act of sort of facing it, um, healing it intentionally, um, while uncomfortable is a part of that exorcism that I talk about as a necessary prerequisite to liberation. If we can't free other people if we're not free, right? So if we continue to hold on to the sort of structures and violence um, left behind by coloniality and oppression and ongoing racism and heteropatriarchy that we ingest all the time, um, we unintentionally pass that on to others, right? So that's the other sort of part of why this work is important, though very difficult. And I think taking that practice seriously for folks who are doing this work with other communities, is what inspired the project to begin with, but it particularly inspires me to keep going with the project because we're always on the front lines of doing this, and we always have to sort of be accountable to each other to take care of ourselves in the context of the larger work that we're doing. So I hope that rambling response answers your question.
It was beautiful. I have one follow-up thought, a question, comment on it. Your research was with educators, right? Educators
Not just
and
educators, yeah.
um, who, by definition, or at least the majority, by definition, are empathetic, right? They spoke about some of the ways in which that helps with healing, but I wonder
Mm.
if in the conversation there were also a discussion or sharing of what are some of the ways in which that really blocks healing.
Yeah. I mean, Relebokile is I love the cornucopia of folks who were engaged in the project because it's cross-generational, right? And so even though the participants are not speaking directly to each other, they're all kind of talking to each other across generational and cultural divides. But Relebo Hilib has been doing this work for decades, right? And she's talking to young, girls in and outside of rural Durban in South Africa about really devastating invasions of their bodily autonomy, right? About violent acts done upon them on their bodies, and briefing her staff, junior colleagues to do that as well. And so the question of how empathy sort of unfolds in the context of her work, I think is a good example for a lot of people doing similar gender facing diversity and justice care work, because we are invested in the work that we do. We deeply care about making lasting and important changes to the way people live their lives. And you know, for Relebogile, the practice of being engaged in this study forced her to confront the ways she was essentially just assuming that it would just all come out in the wash. I know this work is important. This is my life's work. Um, you know, I'll process it somehow. You know, but her empathy um, led her to burnout. Essentially. And that racialized exhaustion, gender-based emotional labor that many of us are doing, she sort of talked about the being confronted with a wall, right? Of I all I do is outward, right? All the work that I do, all of my praxis, all of my deep attention, right, is outward. I don't return any of that like critical, sustained, focused, intentional attention to myself. And many folks who are empathic tend to be receptacles for people's pain, for people's traumas, for people's stories, which we want, right? We want to be able to respond to. But again, this work is only as sustainable as the people who are doing it. And so none of us doing this work will be able to keep on going if we don't take care of ourselves. I know colleagues who've had heart attacks in their 30s and 40s, losing children, losing hair, premature, um, weight gain and like all sorts of issues that they otherwise should not be having because they do not take care of themselves. And this is another reason why I just love doing this project, because I'm doing it not in isolation, but in communion with other people who are we're holding each other accountable to engage in that sustained intentional care practice with each other.
Wonderful. Again, thank you so much for such a fascinating conversation. I feel that was a practice of care, listening to you and your presentation and the conversation, a practice of care from, worthiness. So thank you so
Mm,
much for
mm,
this. I also want to thank all the participants and audience who attended for your presence and for your and for attending the lecture. We will be continuing the series in January. However, we're going to have a next event in less than 2 weeks, our next event on the recent elections, hopeful results of the elections. I hope that you can join us. Keep an eye on your inbox for the details. And I hope that you will keep bringing your curiosity and your voice into the room. Again, on behalf of the Women's and Gender Studies program, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.